10 years ago, he saved me from the gutter. But as I stare at the damning evidence on my screen, I realize I wasn't rescued, I was purchased. Now, with the Service of Internal Security at the door and a shadow from my past holding a detonator, I have to decide if I'm going to be a pawn in their war or the one who burns the entire system to the ground. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, a rhythmic, distorted beat that matched the pounding in my own chest. My hands were slick with sweat as I stared at the encrypted file on my monitor. One click. That's all it would take to drag Mark, the man who had pulled me out of the gutter 10 years ago, into the abyss. I had been living a double life for months, playing the loyal lieutenant while secretly gathering evidence to hand over to the authorities. They were leaning on me, promising complete immunity if I brought them his head on a platter. They wanted the entire organized scheme exposed, and they knew I was the only one with the keys to the kingdom. My phone vibrated on the mahogany desk, a jagged intrusion into the silence of the room. It was him, Mark. He didn't call often, preferring the cold, calculated efficiency of encrypted messages. When he did call, it meant something was about to change. I looked at the screen, the name glowing in the dim light like a neon warning sign. I thought about the house in the suburbs, the fake identity papers tucked away in my safe, and the way Mark had once sat by my bed in the hospital, telling me that we were the only family we had left in this godforsaken world. He had taken me in when I was nothing, fed me, clothed me, and taught me how to survive in a city that wanted to chew me up and spit me out. I clicked the file open. The evidence was damning. There were ledgers detailing the movement of prohibited substances, records of meetings with shadowy figures who dealt in illegal weapons, and a trail of financial transactions that led straight to his personal offshore accounts. It was enough to bury him for dozens of years. It was enough to ensure that he would never breathe free air again. My finger hovered over the send button. My pulse was a frantic bird in my ribcage. If I sent this, I was free. I would be a hero, a witness, a person with a fresh start and a bank account full of hush money. I would leave the chaos behind, the constant threat of a massive legal sentence hanging over my head, and the terrifying reach of the Service of Internal Security that was always watching, always waiting for a slip-up. I stood up, pacing the small, cramped space of my office. The smell of old paper and stale coffee filled my lungs, grounding me in a reality I desperately wanted to escape. I walked over to the bookshelf, my eyes drifting to an old, framed photograph I had kept tucked behind a row of encyclopedias. It was the only thing I had left from the days before I met Mark, the days when I was just a kid trying to survive on the streets, running from a past I had tried to bury. I pulled the frame out, the glass cold beneath my fingertips. Inside the frame was a faded Polaroid of a young man, barely older than 20, standing in front of a dilapidated tenement building. It was me, 3 years before I met Mark. Back then, I was a desperate soul, hungry and alone, caught in the crosshairs of a local group that had tried to frame me for a crime I hadn't committed. I remembered the feeling of the handcuffs hitting my wrists, the cold interrogation room, and the way the world turned gray the moment I thought my life was effectively over. That day, I had been saved by a stranger, someone who saw the flicker of life in my eyes and decided I was worth the risk. I looked at the face in the photo, then back at the monitor. I looked at the evidence, the meticulously compiled dossier that was destined to tear Mark's life apart. I thought about the look in his eyes when he talked about the code he lived by, the loyalty he demanded, and the protection he provided. We weren't just partners. We were artifacts of a world that didn't play by the rules. I reached out and touched the screen, watching the cursor blink rhythmically. It was a countdown to a betrayal so profound it would rewrite my entire history. Suddenly, a faint, metallic click echoed from the doorway behind me. My blood turned to ice. I hadn't heard the door open, which meant one of two things. Either I had lost my mind, or I was no longer alone. I slowly turned, my heart hammering against my ribs, expecting to see security, or perhaps a cleaner sent to mop up a loose end. Instead, I saw a figure standing in the shadows of the hallway, holding a small, weathered leather notebook that I hadn't seen in over a decade. It was the notebook I had lost the day I was almost arrested for that false accusation. The notebook that contained the only proof that could have cleared my name back then, proof that Mark had helped me find. The stranger stepped into the sliver of light filtering through the window, and I felt the air leave my lungs in a sharp, painful gasp. It wasn't an assassin. It wasn't an agent. It was a man I hadn't seen since the night everything changed. A man who held the key to the secret I had guarded for years. A secret that, if revealed, would not only destroy Mark, but also implicate me in the very crime I had been fighting so hard to distance myself from. He looked at me, his face etched with a grim, knowing smile, and tossed the notebook onto the desk right next to my mouse. I stared at the worn leather cover, paralyzed by the realization that my past had finally caught up to me, and the person standing before me wasn't there to save me. He was there to make sure I followed through with the betrayal, no matter the cost. But then, as he reached into his jacket, I saw a flicker of movement, a glint of something cold and sharp hidden in his palm, and realized that the game had just shifted into something much more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. The man in the doorway was taller than I remembered, his frame casting a long, jagged shadow that seemed to swallow the dim light of the office. He didn't move toward me. He simply watched, his eyes scanning the room with the clinical detachment of a predator sizing up a wounded animal. I didn't recognize his face. The scars were new, the intensity of his gaze sharpened by years of living in the darkest corners of the city. But the way he held himself was unmistakable. He belonged to the same ecosystem as Mark, only he carried a different kind of malice, one that didn't rely on loyalty or codes. My fingers, still trembling, hovered inches above the send key. The notebook sat on my desk, a physical manifestation of the secrets I had buried deep within the archives of my own memory. I knew what was inside those pages, the names, the dates, and the precise locations that tied me to a string of illicit operations I had participated in during my first year with Mark. It was the leverage he had always held over me, a silent insurance policy. If I ever turned on him, this book would provide the Služba vnitřní bezpečnosti with enough information to pin a massive legal sentence on me, effectively burying me under an avalanche of accusations. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the man rasped, his voice sounding like gravel grinding against metal. He took a slow, deliberate step into the room, the floorboards creaking under his weight. "Did you think you could scrub the past clean just by burying it? You're smarter than that. You know exactly what happens to people who try to rewrite their own history." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who sent you? Is this Mark's idea of a loyalty test?" The man let out a short, hollow laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Mark doesn't know I'm here. He's currently busy dealing with the fallout of the supply chain disruption you helped orchestrate. He thinks he's hunting a mole. He has no idea that the real danger is sitting right here, contemplating a betrayal that would cost him everything." He moved closer, his gaze locked onto the monitor. The evidence file was still open. The screen glowed, casting a sickly blue light across his face. He leaned down, his presence suffocating, and tapped a finger against the desk. "You think you're the hero of this story, don't you? You think you're going to walk into the sunset with your immunity and your clean slate. But you're just a pawn, and pawns are the first thing sacrificed when the board gets crowded." My heart pounded so hard I could feel the thrumming in my temples. Every word he spoke felt like a tightening noose. I glanced at the drawer where I kept the small, concealed device, a panic button that would alert the local authorities, but also trigger a silent alarm in Mark's personal communication network. It was a lose-lose scenario. If I triggered it, I would be dead before the backup arrived. If I didn't, I was surrendering to whatever sick game the stranger was playing. "What do you want?" I whispered, my hand inches away from the drawer handle. "I want you to finish what you started," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous hum. "But not for them, and definitely not for yourself. You're going to send that file, but you're going to attach a very specific set of routing protocols. You're going to make sure that the evidence doesn't just reach the investigators, it reaches the Internal Security Department's most corrupt handler. You're going to force their hand. You're going to turn this investigation into a war." The implication was clear. He didn't want justice. He wanted total destruction. He wanted to force the organized scheme into the open, to ignite a firestorm that would consume everyone, Mark, the authorities, and me. It was a suicide mission, a way to ensure that no one involved in the operation would ever walk away. I looked at the notebook again. The leather was worn, the corners frayed. I realized, with a sudden, sinking dread, that the handwriting inside wasn't just my own. There were notes in the margins, written in a different ink, a different hand. Someone had been tracking my every move for the last decade, someone who had been waiting for the exact moment I reached my breaking point. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had never been in control. Not when I joined Mark, not when I started gathering the evidence, and certainly not tonight. I was a puppet, and the strings were being pulled by the very people I thought I was trying to escape. "You're not giving me a choice," I said, my voice barely audible. "Choice is a luxury for people who haven't committed crimes," the man replied, pulling the weapon from his jacket. It wasn't a large, loud, or chaotic thing. It was sleek, silenced, and terrifyingly efficient. He held it with an ease that made me realize he had done this many times before. "Send the file, or I'll ensure that your ending is much, much faster than the one the legal system has planned for you." I stared at the screen, my finger trembling over the mouse. My past, my future, my very existence were all distilled into this one moment. I moved the cursor, my mind racing through 1,000 possible outcomes, none of them ending in my survival. I started to type the command line, my hands shaking so violently that I made a mistake, triggering a pop-up window that I hadn't expected. My eyes widened as I read the message on the screen. It wasn't an error message. It was a live feed, an encrypted video stream that had suddenly activated without my input. On the monitor, I saw a room, dark, sterile, and cold, and sitting in the center of the frame, tied to a chair with his face bruised and swollen, was Mark. He was looking directly into the camera lens, his eyes searching, as if he knew exactly where I was and what I was doing. Behind him, a shadow moved, and a voice, cold, familiar, and utterly chilling, spoke through the speakers. "Don't click that button, unless you want to see what happens to the only person who actually cared about you." I froze. The man in my office grinned, his eyes gleaming with a sick, perverse satisfaction. He leaned into my ear, his breath cold against my skin. "It's time to choose, partner. The file or the man? What's it going to be?" The screen flickered, the feed from the dark room stuttering as the connection struggled under the weight of an external firewall. Mark's face, etched with the unmistakable signs of a brutal interrogation, remained fixed on the camera. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't screaming. He was watching me with a haunting, resigned calm, as if he had been expecting this final betrayal, or perhaps this final test, all along. The man beside me pressed the muzzle of his silent weapon against my ribs. "You have 10 seconds, he hissed. "The file goes to the corrupt handler, or the live feed moves from observation to finalization. We both know the kind of people they are, and we both know they don't leave witnesses." My brain felt like it was fracturing. Every instinct I had honed over a decade of surviving in the shadows was screaming at me to run, to smash the monitor, to fight. But the notebook on my desk felt heavier than a lead brick. If I sent the file as he demanded, I was triggering a chain reaction that would result in a massive legal sentence for everyone involved, effectively burning the city to the ground. If I didn't, Mark, my mentor, my protector, the man who had pulled me out of that gutter, would be executed in a room I couldn't reach, in a location I couldn't identify. I looked at the keyboard. My fingers felt like ice blocks. "You're lying," I whispered, my voice cracking. "If you kill him, you lose the leverage. You lose the entire organized scheme. You don't want him dead. You want him controlled." The stranger laughed, a dry, rasping sound that lacked any warmth. He shoved the barrel of the weapon deeper into my side, just hard enough to bruise. "You're trying to rationalize with a man who has nothing left to lose. I don't care about the scheme, and I don't care about the money. I'm the cleanup crew, and I've been waiting a long time to erase the mistake that was made 10 years ago. You were the mistake, and Mark was the one who made it." Everything stopped. The rain against the window, the hum of the cooling fan in the computer tower, the ticking of the clock on the wall. It all faded into a singular, high-pitched ringing in my ears. "What mistake?" I demanded, turning to look at him, forgetting the weapon digging into my flesh. "What are you talking about?" He leaned in closer, his eyes reflecting the blue glow of the screen. "You really think Mark found you by accident that night? You think it was just a coincidence that a street kid with no family and no future happened to be saved by the most powerful man in the city? Look at the dates in that notebook, kid. Look at the ledger entry for the night you were rescued. You weren't a project, and you weren't a protege. You were collateral. You were a debt that needed to be paid, and Mark didn't save you. He bought you. I felt my world tilt. I reached for the notebook, my trembling fingers fumbling with the clasp. I flipped it open, my eyes darting across the familiar, cramped handwriting I had spent years idolizing. My breath caught in my throat. There, tucked behind a series of logs detailing the movement of prohibited substances, was a document. It was a contract, a signed, sealed, and stamped agreement dated 3 days before the night I was supposedly rescued. It was a transfer of custody, a legal document stating that I was to be rehabilitated and integrated into the group, provided I showed the necessary aptitude for loyalty. The man had been telling the truth. My entire life, my entire identity, was built on a foundation of orchestrated events. Mark hadn't been my savior, he had been my handler from the very beginning. The kindness he showed me, the protection, the family, it was all part of a grooming process designed to turn me into the perfect, obedient instrument for his organized scheme. A sudden sound shattered the tension in the room, a loud, rhythmic knocking at the door. Not a polite rap, but the heavy, deliberate thud of a battering ram. The Служба внутренней безопасности had arrived. The internal security check had finally reached our floor, tracking the encrypted signals I had been unknowingly leaking for months. "Time's up," the man said, his face tightening with a mix of fury and panic. He looked at the door, then back at me, his finger tensing on the trigger. "You're going to decide now. If you don't send that file, I'm going to kill you, and then I'm going to make sure the evidence is destroyed before they break down that door. But if you do send it, the server will trace the signal back to this building. You'll be the primary target for everyone, the authorities, the group, and whoever is holding Mark. You'll be a marked man for the rest of your life." The knocking grew louder. The doorframe began to splinter. I looked at the monitor, then at the notebook, then at the man who was about to end it all. I realized that the choice I was facing wasn't between loyalty or betrayal. It was between being a prisoner of my past or an architect of my own demise. I slammed my hand onto the keyboard. I didn't send the file to the handler. I didn't send it to the authorities. I hit the master override key, a command I had hidden deep within the code, designed to broadcast the entire archive to every news outlet and public server in the city. It was a digital suicide bomb. It would expose the organized scheme, the prohibited substances, the illegal weapons, the corruption of the security service, and, most importantly, the connection between Mark and the very people who were currently trying to silence him. The man's eyes widened in disbelief. "You idiot," he hissed, the weapon wavering for a fraction of a second. "You've just signed your own death warrant." As the upload progress bar began to tick upward, 10%, 20%, 30%, the door exploded inward, sending splinters of wood flying across the room. Flashbang grenades hissed, filling the office with blinding white light and deafening noise. Through the chaos, I saw the man turn, his weapon leveled at me, but before he could fire, a second figure leaped from the doorway, someone I recognized instantly. It was Mark, his face bruised and bloody, his hands still tied behind his back, but his eyes burning with a desperate, frantic intensity. He lunged for the man, and as they collided, a gunshot rang out, followed by a scream that cut through the sound of the falling furniture. Everything plunged into darkness, and the last thing I felt was the cool, sharp edge of the blade I had hidden in my desk, as I realized the fight had only just begun. The room descended into a chaotic blur of sound and motion. The flashbang left my vision swimming in jagged spots of violet and white, but my hearing returned in a sharp, painful ringing. I dropped to the floor, sliding under the heavy oak desk, just as the office was swarmed by figures in tactical gear. The Служба внутренней безопасности had breached, but the chaos was total. The cleanup guy had been knocked off balance by Mark's desperate lunge, and the shot that rang out had shattered the glass of the window, sending shards raining down like deadly confetti. I pressed my back against the cold wall behind the knee-hole of the desk, my lungs burning from the acrid smoke of the grenades. Through the gaps between the desk legs, I saw boots, dozens of them. They weren't moving with the precision of a tactical team. They were moving with the frantic energy of a group that had just realized their entire operation was being broadcast to the world. The upload progress bar on my monitor was still visible, creeping agonizingly toward 60%. If it reached 100, the evidence of the organized scheme, the records of the prohibited substances, and the proof of high-level corruption would be irreversible. "Find the terminal!" a voice bellowed, a voice I recognized. It was the director of the Internal Security Department, the very man I had intended to expose. His voice wasn't filled with the triumph of an officer making an arrest. It was filled with the primal fear of a man whose legacy was seconds away from disintegration. I looked over at Mark. He had managed to roll away from the cleanup man, his hands still bound, kicking out with his legs to keep his assailant at bay. The cleanup man was scrambling to recover his weapon, which had skidded across the hardwood floor toward the doorway. "They're not here to arrest us!" Mark shouted, his voice hoarse and desperate. "They're here to wipe the slate. Get to the server, kid. Don't let them touch that machine." I knew he was right. If the Sluzhba Vnutrennye Bezopasnosti reached my computer before the upload finished, they would pull the plug, scrub the drives, and bury me alongside the truth. My life had been a lie, a fabricated history designed to make me a tool, but for the first time, I felt a genuine, burning autonomy. I wasn't doing this for Mark. I wasn't doing this for the authorities. I was doing it to finally, definitively, end the cycle. I scrambled from beneath the desk, grabbing the heavy, antique letter opener I'd kept in the bottom drawer. It was an archaic weapon, but it was all I had. I lunged, not for the man in the doorway, but for the workstation. "Stop him!" the director screamed, leveling a sidearm at my chest. A bullet tore through the air, shattering the wooden chair I had been sitting in just a second before. I dove behind the server tower, the heat of the machines radiating against my skin. I reached up and pulled the physical Ethernet cable, not to stop the upload, but to force the system to switch to the backup wireless relay I had installed in the ceiling vents weeks ago. It was a redundant measure, a hidden failsafe. If I died, the data would still reach the news outlets within 3 minutes. I looked up and caught Mark's eye. He wasn't looking at me with the cold authority of a handler anymore. For the first time, there was a raw, human apology etched into his features. He knew that the moment I pushed this through, he was a dead man. The organized scheme would tear him apart before the authorities ever got the chance. "The ventilation shaft!" Mark yelled, nodding toward the ceiling. "There's a hatch behind the bookshelf. Get out while you can." I hesitated. "I'm not leaving you." "You have to!" he roared, throwing his entire body weight into the cleanup man, pinning him against the wall. "If you stay, the truth dies with us. Go!" The director stepped into the light, his face a mask of cold, bureaucratic rage. He aimed his weapon at Mark, his finger tightening on the trigger. I realized then that my choices had led to this. The man who had saved me was going to take the final bullet for my rebellion. I scrambled to the bookshelves, pushing aside the heavy volumes, my fingers searching for the mechanism. I felt the latch, but at that exact moment, the office lights flickered and died. The room plunged into absolute darkness, save for the pulsating, rhythmic glow of the monitor showing the upload progress. 92%. In the darkness, I heard the sound of a slide racking back on a pistol, right next to me. I wasn't alone. Someone else was in the room, someone who hadn't spoken, someone who had been waiting for the exact moment the chaos reached its peak. A hand, cold and gloved, clamped over my mouth, and a voice whispered into my ear. "You made a mess, boy. Now, let's see if you have the stomach to survive the fallout." The person holding me spun me around, and as the moonlight filtered through the broken window, I saw who it was. My heart stopped. It wasn't the director. It wasn't the cleanup man. It was someone I had seen in that old Polaroid, someone who was supposed to be dead. Someone who had been pulling my strings since before I even met Mark. As the upload bar hit 99%, the person pulled a small, remote detonator from their pocket and whispered, "They aren't just going to raid this office, kid. They're going to level the entire block." The person holding the detonator was my father, or rather, the man who had been reported dead in a house fire 20 years ago. The resemblance was haunting, a mirror image of the face I had stared at in the Polaroid for a decade. He wasn't the man from the photo. He was a ghost, a remnant of a past that had never truly been buried. Before I could process the shock, the upload bar on the screen flashed. 100% complete. The room groaned. Across the city, in every major newsroom and federal server, the files were now spreading like a virus. The organized scheme was effectively dismantled in a single keystroke. "It's done," my father whispered, his grip on my shoulder unyielding. "The world knows, but you, my son, have made the world a very dangerous place." Mark roared from across the room, breaking free of the cleanup man's grip. He lunged toward us, ignoring the weapon pointed at his chest by the director. "Don't trust him!" Mark screamed. "He isn't here to save you! He's the one who sold you to me in the first place!" The revelation didn't shatter me. It clarified everything. The grooming, the rescue, the entire decade of my life was a transaction between two masters, and I was the currency. I looked at the detonator in my father's hand, then at the exit, and finally at Mark, a man who was a monster, but a monster who had treated me with a bizarre, twisted form of loyalty. "You're all the same," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. I didn't reach for the letter opener. I reached for the fire alarm lever on the wall behind me. "Don't!" my father hissed, his composure finally fracturing. I pulled the lever. The sprinkler system hissed for a microsecond before exploding into life, drenching the room in a freezing deluge. The electronic devices sputtered and died. The tactical team, blinded by the sudden downpour and the confusing roar of the alarms, lost their formation. In the chaos, I shoved my father back into the shelving unit, the impact causing a structural collapse of the old, rotted bookcases. I didn't wait to see if he got up. I dove toward the open window, the one the cleanup man had shattered earlier. I gripped the fire escape railing, the cold metal biting into my palms, and dropped to the alleyway below, just as the ground floor of the building rocked with a muffled, controlled explosion. It wasn't the total leveling my father had threatened. It was a targeted hit meant to silence the witnesses. I didn't look back. I ran. I ran through the rain-slicked maze of the city, through alleys that felt like the ones I had crawled through as a child, shedding my identity with every step. I threw my phone into a storm drain, watched it sink into the darkness, and kept moving until the sirens were just a distant, fading hum. 3 months later, I sat in a small coastal town thousands of miles away. My hair was longer, my face scarred by the memory of that night, and my name was something I'd plucked from a tombstone in a graveyard 3 states back. I had no money, no connections, and for the first time, no masters. The news of the Great Exposure had dominated the headlines for weeks. The Internal Security Department had been purged, the organized scheme was under heavy federal investigation, and the names of the men who had traded my life like a stock option were plastered on every wanted poster in the country. I heard a heavy footstep on the porch of the small cabin I was renting. I didn't reach for a weapon. I reached for a book. The door creaked open. It was Mark. He looked older, gaunt, with a deep scar running from his temple to his jaw. He didn't look like a kingpin anymore. He looked like a man who had survived a war and had no interest in starting another. He stood on the threshold, watching me. He didn't come inside. He simply reached into his coat and tossed something onto the porch, a thick, sealed envelope. "The authorities think we're both dead," he said, his voice quiet. "The cleanup crew is gone, and the people we exposed are too busy running for their own lives to care about us. This is everything that was left of the accounts. I don't want it. I don't want the life. I just wanted to see if you made it." He turned to leave, but stopped, looking back one last time. "You were the only thing I ever did that wasn't a transaction, kid. I'm sorry it took a betrayal to prove that to you." He walked away, vanishing into the mist of the morning. I didn't follow him. I picked up the envelope, felt the weight of it, and then threw it into the wood-burning stove. I watched as the money, the blood money that had defined my existence, curled into black ash and floated up the chimney. I sat back in my chair, listening to the waves crash against the cliffs. I was finally, truly, nobody. And as the sun began to rise over the ocean, I realized that for a man who had been built by others, being nobody was the greatest freedom I would ever know. The past was burned, the betrayal was silenced, and the future was finally, terrifyingly, entirely my own.